Hi everyone, Stefan here. I thought I would just do a little solo presentation. So just while everyone is coming in, I'm just going to be chatting today a little bit about Bitcoin articles that actually aren't about Bitcoin directly. So make sure you hit share and retweet and subscribe if you haven't already, wherever you're watching this. And so I'm just going to chat a little bit today about some different articles that you can show to your friends and teach them a little bit about the problems of fiat money, right? So obviously many of us are into Bitcoin, right? But we sometimes overwhelm our friends when we're trying to teach them a little bit about Bitcoin. And so sometimes it's easy to give them an article that doesn't directly mention Bitcoin. And so that's the point of what I'm chatting about today. So you'll also notice, for those of you who have read my friend Safety Namusa's book, The Bitcoin Standard, he doesn't even mention Bitcoin for like probably the first half of that book or so. So that's a good example there where he's setting it up first to say, hey, this is the scenario that we're in. This is some of the history. These are some of the politics. This is some of the economics of what's going on. All right. So for those of you who are here, make sure you throw a comment in there. Let me know you're in here. I'm going to try to make these interactive, and I'm going to try to do a few of these occasional solo streams just for people to try and make Bitcoin easy for people to understand. So so drop a comment if you're on Periscope or YouTube or wherever you're watching. So I guess a little bit of the setup around what was the impetus, how did this get started, right? I actually responded to one of my friends, Stacy. So she's working at CASA. So let me just put the screen share on. This one, right? So you guys can see that there. Eski, shout out to Eski in the comments. Hey, man. Hi, Scott. Thanks for joining me. So guys, so you can see here, this is, maybe I'll go full screen and put, so you can see here, maybe if I blow that up a little bit. So you can see here, this was the part of why I thought to try this out. And so you can see here, this idea of what are some articles that don't go too hardcore into Bitcoin, but talk a little bit about the problems of fiat money, right? And so one of my responses was this one, how inflation drinks your milkshake. So that'll be one of the ones we talk about today. And funnily enough, that was, this is one of the common ones that I like to show people just because it doesn't, it's relatively easy to understand, right? So what are we going to, so let me put that one up. Okay, so firstly, we're going to talk a little bit about how inflation drinks your milkshake. So how does it, like, what's the point of this article, right? So in this article, Dan Sanchez, so he used to be at the Mises Institute, and I think now he's at FEE, Foundation for Economic Education. And so this article has been kind of ported over. I think it was first built from one of his speeches, right? But the point here being, wouldn't we all like to see our money supply increase? But understand that if you just did that at a society level, that wouldn't necessarily make us all richer, right? So you can see here, this analogy here. So imagine if Murray Rothbard's analogy is, if you just magically 10 times everyone's money, would we actually be richer? Well, hold on a sec. No, you wouldn't. Tim, shout out. Thanks for watching. So yeah, guys, feel free to just kind of ask questions if you kind of are confused or whatever. So one of what we're getting at here is this idea that it's not so much about how many tickets or pieces of money are out there. It's about our productive resources that are out there. That's actually what's most important. And that's the point we have to make when we're talking to some of our friends about what are some of the problems with fiat money. So you can see here spelling out some of the problems with that. And so this is why I think this is a great single shot article you can send to somebody and they can learn a little bit more about the problems of inflation. And so you can have a look and say, well, look, even if you added here, even if everyone go ahead and write a 0 at the end of your money balance, are we any richer? Do we have any more computers or more equipment? No, none of those things have changed. We still fundamentally have the same amount of wealth in society. All you've done is just create more paper tickets. And nowadays it's all digital anyway, obviously. But it's just there to help you understand the point. And so the problem is that it's very insidious and hidden in some ways, right? Inflation creates winners and losers, and that's an important factor that most people they don't conceive of this, right? And what happens is when you lose out to this inflation, it happens in a hidden way, and that's hence the analogy inflation sipping your milkshake, right? Because it's like some people get that new money first, and then those people benefit. So that's an important part to remember here. So you can see here, the new money bid up the price of what he was selling to his benefit. So in that regard, he might have been a winner in the short term, but you have to also consider what was his income, and was his income being inflated, right? Or whose income is rising rather. So you've just got to consider. So again, like, we're not going to go through every piece of the whole article, but it's essentially, the point is it happens in a hidden way where those people who get the new money first are the ones who win at the cost of other people. And so it takes a little bit of work to explain that point, where basically it essentially ends up favoring bankers and people who get those new loans first. And that's why you see things like big property development companies who are all getting really cheap loans, that a lot of, and people who are invested into those companies, or potentially people who work in those companies, they're the ones who win out of that. And guess what else? Government is it's in a lot of debt. And so government benefits from this kind of system, right? And so people, in some sense, they argue in favor of that system because it benefits them, right? So it's not like some deep, dark conspiracy, but rather people are just kind of pushing in the direction that suits themselves. But for you as an individual, it's also on you to think about, well, hey, what's best for me? What should I be saving in? What kind of money, what would make sense for society to select as a better money? And that's, again, that kind of brings up this whole Bitcoin question, right? So I want to open up another essay. This one is called "How is Fiat Money Possible?" And this is a fantastic essay by Hans-Hermann Hoppe. It is just a phenomenal essay, I think, for people who haven't really considered these questions more deeply, right? And yeah, exactly right. It is the Cantillon effect, as Scott's saying. So I think it's important to consider, did fiat money just arise naturally? Was it some emergent thing that just came up and the world just chose this? And clearly the answer is no. The world didn't just choose this. It was really more about how governments essentially pushed us into this pathway where we have to essentially use their chosen money for a few reasons. Typically legal tender laws, punitive capital gains tax laws, these things that sort of keep you within that system. And so also in this essay, Hans-Hermann Hoppe, I think he explains a little bit around how they've sort of taken away the cost of just producing more money, because they've kind of put themselves in place as the monopolist of money, right? So in this essay, we're just moving down through the essay a little bit, but you can see. So you can see he's firstly starting with the story around what's the Mengerian story around money, right? So he's starting with here, motivated only by self-interest and based on the observation that directly traded goods possess different degrees of marketability, some individuals begin to demand specific goods not for their own sake, but for the sake of employing them as a medium of exchange, right? And so that he's getting to this idea of, oh, it's the indirect medium of exchange. We use that as money, right? So that's an example there. And you can see, so over time, right, it kind of, it changes along the way, right? And so then we get into some more discussion around things like, okay, so we get into this discussion of how we get this kind of devolution of money, right? Because the government puts in its controls and says, oh, you've got to use my money. You have to use my specific thing. And an important point that Hopper makes in this essay is around redemption, right? As in redemption of money. So let's say you put your pieces of gold in the vault, and then the bank gives you a paper ticket at like a claim for that gold, right? So this comes to that question of money proper, which is the gold, the commodity money itself, versus the money substitute, right? The ticket, the paper of claim of gold, right? And so what is important to understand here is that at certain times and in certain places, banks suspended redemption of your gold with your paper ticket, right? So the idea being, well, hold on, I thought I had this money. How come I can't claim it? I can't use it. I can't take it out. Well, why would any normal person demand not being able to redeem their money, right? The only scenario where this kind of thing would work is if the government protected those banks that suspended that redemption. And so in some way, you can think of it like the market has checks against banks who try to do the wrong thing and expand beyond the amount of gold that they really have. And so in this essay, Hopper is sort of explaining some of that point around redemption in specie. So that's an important point there. There's also a point here around, this idea of currency zones, right? That you would have different money in use around the world in different monies used around the world. And why wouldn't it make sense to have each of those monies has its own little commercial zone, right? But the point Hopper is making here is more like this is technically still a system of partial barter, right? So we're living in this world, there's, 200 countries or whatever that is. And, there's probably only 10 or 20 major fiat money currencies, but still, it's still kind of, we're living in this world of partial barter in some way. And that's highly inefficient, right? And so those of us in the Bitcoin world see it like, well, Bitcoin's just a better money. And when you travel overseas, you can just, over time, as more and more people develop and build up their Bitcoin savings pool, then they have an ability to start transacting directly in Bitcoin. And so that's arguably way more just efficient, right? You don't have to kind of go between other currencies. So it may be that at the start, it may seem a little more, that there's a little bit more friction to that right now. But over time, as more and more people build up their own savings pool within Bitcoin, then they can start spending, and they can actually have that kind of buying and spending aspect of Bitcoin and using that in their own little economies. But it'll take time to develop out. So that's how I'm seeing that. And I think an important point is just to understand the distinction there between commodity credit and circulation credit. So what we're getting at here is, in a full reserve banking world, all claims for money are fully backed, that there's no kind of IOUs going over and above the amount in that reserve. And so the problem that arises is when a certain institutional bank issues tickets above and issues out loans for people with more tickets than there are gold in the vault. And what that does, and when you look at that on a macro level, that causes this problem of malinvestment that we talk about. So that's part of the problem that we have to understand when we're talking about what's commodity credit, which means somebody actually is foregoing their spending for you to be able to borrow and use that capital, right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not about how many paper tickets there are; it's about how many resources and how many people there are out there, right? So yeah, thanks, Eski. Eski's loving it. Yeah, simplified. It's a bamboozling. Yeah, so hopefully that's making sense for you guys. Make sure you definitely ask questions in the chat. I'm happy to chat with you. I normally when I'm doing interviews, I won't necessarily be able to interact as much with the chat, but when I'm just solo, obviously I can. Oh yeah, shout out Rico, watching from Paris. Thanks, man. So it comes to this question. It comes to so this question, it comes to replacing commodity money with fiat money. It requires government intervention. It didn't just naturally happen. It wasn't just a natural emergence or occurrence. And I think that's a point that people miss when they are talking about, okay, I work in the Fed, and they're writing some technical paper and so on. And yeah, definitely Safety's chapter on malinvestment was awesome. And I think there's a lot of it's really interesting as well on this point, because there's a lot of different Austrians who write there in their own different way, and they explain it in their own different way around how malinvestment and interest rates cause that. And so Hayek has an explanation, Mises has an explanation, Rothbard has an explanation. Pretty much all the well-known Austrians, they've all written their own essays or their own books explaining this concept. And it's interesting because you can see people put their own slightly different spin on things. And so that's an interesting aspect also. So I guess going back to this, basically it's really, we have to think of it like money is a good, it's a special good. And so it depends what what are the characteristics of that money, and then there's competition there around that, and it's kind of, these goods are in some sense competing to become money. So that's one way to think about it there. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next essay I wanted to talk about, which is why the state demands control of money. So I think this is a interesting one also. So let me just put the screen share on for that. So yeah, so you can see here, this is another essay on the Mises Institute. You can see it here. It's by Hunter and Hopper. It talks about why the state demands control of money. Now, when you are the monopolist, right? If you are you are the state, you are the ruler, right? He's assessing from that perspective, from that mindset. If you were the ruler, what could you do? What would you do? And so here he's talking about how, imagine you're in command, and what would be your attitude and your policy in relation to money? What would your incentive be, right? So he's not saying every government has to operate in exactly this way. It's just that this is their tendency, right? Their natural tendency. So you can see why, firstly, obviously, you'd be interested in money and money affairs. Like, why wouldn't you, right? And so because money is the most easily and widely saleable and acceptable good, you get the most freedom to spend that income as you like. And so that's obviously an important factor there. So you, generally speaking, you want to maximize your money tax revenues, right? But there are some difficulties with this, because if you try to explicitly tax people, they're not going to be happy about that, obviously. And so you have one other option. You can borrow, but then even then you've got to go to the banks and you need to pay interest. So how best to free yourself of these constraints? Well, you become the monopolist of money. You decide who may use which forms of money, and then you basically control that system. And in doing so, you can basically lower the cost of money production, and because you have set it up in a way where you are getting So here, so you can say on your territory, only you are permitted to produce money, right? And so then what happens is we see this kind of competition of, going down to the lowest denominator, if you will, or competing down to the lowest, because more importantly, you must use your monopoly position in order to lower the production cost and the quality of money as close as possible to zero. So instead of costly money like gold and silver, in those days, you can basically produce these worthless pieces of paper. Now, obviously, again, it's all digital now, but the point is still there, right? That you can costlessly or very cheaply produce this money. And what impact does that have? Well, you can think about that. Now, what would happen if everyone was free to produce money? Well, you can see here, under competitive conditions, if everyone were free to produce money, a money that can be produced at almost zero cost would be produced up to a quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And because marginal cost is zero, the marginal revenue, the purchasing power of this money would be zero as well. So in some way, otherwise, because basically he's also getting at this idea that if you just kept on printing, they would have to, people would try to flee, right? They want to get out into other, they want to they want to flee out into commodity money where they can better hold their wealth. And so it's kind of like an alchemy sort of thing. You've produced something valuable out of something practically worthless. So that's an important point here. And so here's another important aspect. So he's saying, what are the effects? Well, first and foremost, more paper money does not in the slightest affect the quantity or quality of other non-monetary goods, right? And Rico in the chat's great point here. He's talking about all kinds of pretty much people printing their own money, and purchasing power is literally just created out of nothing. So that's a great point, and I think that's essentially why we've seen so many people who are very keen to go and produce their own money, right? And then people just put on other justifications for it and say, oh, this feature, that feature, whatever, this is why. But really, everyone wants to be the one to print money. So, that's just the way things go. So you can see here, talking a little bit about the problem, right? The problem for you and your friends with this institutional setup is not that it doesn't work. It works perfectly, but you have to avoid hyperinflation, right? So that's basically the setup, right? That they want to do this because that's just, that's just the way you can get more for yourself. And so we've also got to consider here that as more money is brought into circulation, prices will be higher. And so it just over time, it just pushes the prices up without necessarily making the economy more efficient or more productive or something like that. And it just changes the structure of production, right? And so I think another interesting point was the point that in this essay around the difference between just print and spend versus the lending of new money into existence, right? And that's a point where, if you look at, say, the Zimbabwe's of the world, where they might just straight up print the money, whereas those other countries that set up a fractional reserve system that enables private banks to loan new funds into existence. So that's also like a different way of looking at it as well. So with Venezuela and cryptocurrency mining, well, I guess the thing there is people have cheap electricity, so it's going to be an incentive there for people to try, if they can get access to that cheap electricity or free electricity, that obviously you want to run some Bitcoin mining on that, right? So I think here Hopper's explaining a little bit around the business cycle, right? So he's saying, look, if you brought it back to just, Robinson Crusoe on the island, and what would that look like? And so if you had a certain amount of savings, right? So you had caught some fish, and now you're going to use that to eat, right? So that you can still eat while you're constructing the net. And this net is the idea being, it's capital. It's there to make you more productive. And so if this was, if there was no backing by real fish savings, well then, fish. So then Friday is not going to be able to do this because Friday won't have the fish to consume, right? And so it's just only that. So you can see then, and necessarily so, Friday must fail in his investment endeavor. In a simple barter economy, of course, this becomes immediately apparent. Friday will not accept Robinson's paper credit in the first place, but only real commodity credit. And so because of this, there won't be a boom-bust cycle where in our fiat money world with paper money, it's being created out of thin air and it's less noticeable. So that's the point to understand from this essay. And so you can see, and so here, they've got here, form of print and loan wealth redistribution versus the print and spend policy. Well, that's that point I was making before about, like, say, the Zimbabwe kind of print and spend style versus the print and loan, which is operating elsewhere. So yeah, I just want to take a question here from Shifty Darky. So great stream, super informative. Do you believe there is resistance to Bitcoin because people have difficulty imagining a system not governed by their government? I think essentially that is a big part of it. I think the other thing, though, is that most people just haven't thought about money and what it is to begin with, right? They just use it, right? They just earn some money and they just spend it and that's it. And so it becomes difficult to explain because many people don't even have the tool set to consider what it would otherwise be. So it reminds me of a classic saying by Frederick Bastiat, where basically he was saying, it's as though, because if we object to the government raising grain, it's as though we thought that nobody should raise grain at all, right? Like this idea of food production. And, I think, imagine if government owned every fast food store and, or every food store, then people would be walking around saying, oh, hang on, you want to have private food stores? Like, how does that work, right? And it's only a concept because it's just not how we're used to thinking about these things, and it's just not what we're taught. But you can sort of analogize, right? You can say, well, hold on, if we have a free market in the creation of computer devices, and it's not that we need a government to make our PCs or that we need a government to make our phones. Now, it becomes tricky because there's regulation and things, but the fundamental point is these are privately owned businesses and they can produce it. And so in some sense, this one is the question of Bitcoin is perhaps even a bit more difficult to consider, just because it's not just kind of making a product that people are used to, right? Like, oh, you give me this, you give me $2 and I'll give you this loaf of bread or whatever. Here we're talking about the market creating the actual money itself as well. Now, historically, gold, was money, and that was, chosen by the market. Now, the whole point that we would make is that really it's been co-opted. So yeah, so hopefully that helped you. Hi, Mike, CSS. So yeah, so coming back to this, yeah. So a lot of people they compare Bitcoin to other investments, and so this is an episode. I discussed this in episode 109 of my podcast with Preston Pish as well. So we spoke about some of this, right? Because the typical person, the typical investor, is thinking, okay, how does Bitcoin make a return? Because people are thinking purely from like a dividends or an interest payments perspective, and that's the wrong mindset. You have to think more about it like, what happens if you had a deflationary money competing against inflationary monies? And so that's probably the point to understand there. Mike. Oh, sorry, Matt. I didn't see your question. Do you want to just ask it again? Yeah. So, okay. Sorry, just seeing one other question. Okay, yeah. So, do I advocate owning some gold as well? Personally, I don't own gold. I think the like, again, everyone has their own opinion, but for me, I see it like gold is not going to be remonetized. I don't see the world going back to gold. I think it will always be seen as too easily centralized. It's difficult to say, but yeah, I used to hold gold, but nowadays I don't. I see it like Bitcoin just supersedes it. I really think Bitcoin just supersedes it longer term. Now, is it fair to maybe hold a small position? Maybe, yeah. But I don't think it's going to become like global money that everyone uses again, because it's just too liable to being centralized. And so, yeah. But that said, though, other people have different views. Some of them think, yeah, there's a space for both, right? To have Bitcoin and some gold. And obviously, many of the gold people and Bitcoin people have a similar thesis. They want market chosen money. They don't want government chosen or influenced money. So, yeah. Where I think Bitcoin price. So look, I'm not really a price guy, so probably not the best person to ask. I'm more interested sort of in the medium and longer term, and people adopting it just broadly as a way to save. So I think that's my perspective on that. So let me bring up another one. This one's a really good one. It's called Deflation and Liberty. So this is a classic. I really recommend it for people to go and have a look at that, because you can really quickly. It's a shorter read. Like, these are kind of like 50-page-ish, or sometimes a bit less. They're sort of like a short novel, a novella, whatever you want to call it, right? Like essays that are a bit easier to read, and that's partly why I chose some of these just for us to talk about, because yeah, it just helps make it easy for you when you're trying to teach your friend. If you want to just give them one thing to give them, then that you can pick one of these. I think probably the best one is How Inflation Drinks Your Milkshake, but I think Deflation and Liberty is also a fantastic one too. So I think one important point here in some of the early sections is essentially Guido Hulsmann here. Now, Guido Hulsmann was also on my show. He was on episode 51 of my podcast. Yaddle Zap, do you think Australia is a puppet of China? Don't know. Maybe in some ways, we Australian institutions have been influenced by China, right? And so the story here with some of these Australian universities, where the VCs, the vice chancellors, had targets in terms of how well they were basically sucking up to China. So, potentially in some small ways, but not in an overall way, I would say no. So yeah, bringing it back to Deflation and Liberty by Guido Hulsmann. So one of the important points here is that oh, thanks, Vek. I've got another question here. Is a prerequisite of the Austrian school smaller societies or economic networks? No, not necessarily. I wouldn't say that. Like, I would say it's more like it's more like Austrians are more focused on the actions at an individual level, and then they use certain analogies like this whole Robinson Crusoe idea to help teach the point. So that's how I would explain that it's more looking at what is the action being done by the individual and why are they doing it, right? So it's about understanding that. And so the method of praxeology is really about trying to start from a first principle that people can all easily agree on, or they can reflect on and know that to be true, and then reason forward from that. So that's how I would think of that. Yeah, so thoughts on government engaging in warfare to destroy Bitcoin, erode the trust. Can they find a way to hack or destroy it? So look, I think it's very unlikely. So there's a few things. There's a fair few points we can talk about there, but the main one really is just that people can just store their wealth outside of the system, and over time, Bitcoin is becoming stronger and stronger, and there are more and more ways for people to do this sort of thing where they can really just start transacting in a way that nobody can stop you. And so I guess, theoretically, is it possible? Yes, they could theoretically go and, maybe if there was some kind of unknown bug that was slipped in, but at the same time, there's a lot of people looking at the code and there's a lot of people assessing these things. Now, there have been bugs found in Bitcoin before, right? So I don't want to sell it and say, oh, look, there's no chance. But I just think it's very unlikely. And over time, it's more about comfort in the overall system. And as more and more people just become comfortable using Bitcoin, spending Bitcoin, saving Bitcoin, then it just becomes this parallel system that people can build. And I think it is, it just becomes a system that you can opt into. And so that's kind of the higher level way that I would think about that. Question here from Matt. So the question is, for those viewing hyper-Bitcoinization as an inevitability, is this the end of modern nation states? So I would say it's eventually signaling the end of the large big state. I think, although I would like to see anarcho-capitalism, I don't know if it happens in my lifetime. I would like to see that. I don't know if it will. But I think what we will end up with is a lot more smaller city states. So I think it's a question what's a more achievable step in the direction of liberty, right? That permits more people to have liberty, right? And so one interesting episode on my podcast, which you might be interested in, Matt, is episode 161 with Titus Gable. So he's from Free Private Cities, and we spoke a little bit about that idea. Another interesting episode you might like is the one I did with Phil Bonello. So we were talking about the sovereign individual. And so that's an important book, or an interesting book, amongst Bitcoin circles and libertarian circles. You can view that almost like a techno-libertarian futurist view. And so the idea being more and more people will be able to transact outside the purview of a state. And in doing so, they can start building up their own commerce outside the state. And what does that do? It erodes some of that power of large nation states. So will it lead to the end of the nation state? I don't know. I'd love to see it, obviously, but there's a difference between what I want to see and what I think is likely. What I think is likely is we'll have smaller states. Hey, Nick, thanks for joining us. What percentage global Bitcoin adoption do you think is the tipping point of the S-curve? Good question. I don't know that I've got a really good answer, right? I think if you look at, the whole Simon Sinek stuff, crossing that chasm and so on, or if you look at the whole intransigent minority, people talk about 10%, right, of growing in the US to 10 million and so on. So that's kind of all I could really say. But I think it depends what view you have as well, right? So some people might view it look, Bitcoin might just stay in a more, let's call it, monetary vigilante role, right? That it might be more it just stays in the shadows, if you will. And then there are other people who have more the view hey, this thing is just a better money and it's just going to get adopted by more and more people. And what happens is just as people see everyone else going into it, then it causes that kind of spike. So I guess your question is kind of getting at where is that tipping point? When does it happen? And unfortunately, I don't think I've got a set. I couldn't just tell you, once we get 10 million people, then we'll have it. But I think over these next 5 to 10 years, I think that tipping point will happen. But it's going to take some time. So I think it's just like really a patience game. Got a question from SC358. So the question is around China developing a quantum computer to attack Bitcoin. So this question, I did explore this question with Stepan Snigirev from Crypto Advance. He is a quantum scientist, and he used to manage a lab doing this exact kind of research. Well, not on Bitcoin, but on quantum. And I think the main answer is, well, there's two impacts. So one is on the mining aspect, but if everyone's got quantum, then it's not really a big deal, and they won't be able to go beyond 21 million anyway, because again, the difficulty adjustment would kick in, right? But on the other side, around trying to brute force or trying to take someone's public key and understand what is their private key, that kind of thing is well off. It's a long way off, and I think before we get there would be efforts made to basically do some kind of post-quantum cryptography. But as I understand, just from listening to some of the Bitcoin experts, they've mentioned that basically one of the problems is some of the cryptography that is resistant against quantum computing is not necessarily resistant against classical computing. So then, and there's also the question around how computationally expensive and so on is it to have this yet. So really, it's more like a question where like you'll just basically have to wait and see. But the short answer is yes, they'll be able to. Bitcoin will essentially fork to change and include some kind of quantum resistant cryptography should that be necessary. And it's a long way off, even if it is feasible. At least that's my understanding of it. But yeah, go and check out episode 84 of my podcast for more kind of discussion from like a real expert, whereas certainly I'm not an expert on that, right? So yeah. And yeah, so yeah, I mean, Bitcoin is still very, very small. So it is, yeah, I think it's not going to be relevant for people. People aren't going to care enough to go and look at that until then, until at least like another 10x or more of Bitcoin. So governments have other things that they're more concerned about. So I think for that reason, we shouldn't necessarily be like, oh, it's the sky's falling or anything like that. It's still pretty small. Okay, so back to deflation and liberty. So one of the important points here is that because the US government prints its own money, it can have any quantity of dollars and pay back its debt. So in that way, government bonds are given a security that no other debtor can offer. And that's an important point, because this is part of how government enables massive expansion in its debt. And then what does that do? Well, it enables a massive expansion in the size of the government, just in general. And so Guido goes into that in a little bit more detail. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, check out episode 84 for anyone else interested. Yeah. Oh, actually, I can probably pull it up here. Yeah, this is the one. So yeah, so you can see there. So he's a quantum physicist. Okay, so back to deflation and liberty. So essentially the point is over time, modern economists have basically spelled it out and tried to argue that, oh, look, see, deflation is bad. And many Austrian economists have kind of countered back against that. So in this essay, Guido Hulsmann is sort of trying to take the full-throated position of trying to praise deflation, right? And see why deflation in some ways protects our liberties. So that's another factor here. So for example, here Guido is explaining that historically, Mises and Rothbard championed deflation to the extent it accelerated the readjustment of the economy, but they sought to avoid deflation in all other contexts. Whereas I think in this essay and this article, Guido is sort of going a little bit further and talking more about, well, what about deflation in other contexts? And we should understand in which contexts does it matter? And so I think the key point here is also that there's no reason why an increase in money supply should create more growth, right? Because again, as we were mentioning before, it really is about the physical structure of production as opposed to how much money there is, right? So just printing more paper tickets does not make us richer. That's the fundamental point. And so once you conceive of that, then it becomes a lot easier to understand that these guys are just playing games, right? They're just making up, like the central banks of the world are just kind of playing these games and making up their own little techno-babble excuses when that's not making society any richer. And if it really did make society richer, why don't they just go print trillions of dollars, right? And yeah, they are kind of doing that in some sense, right? But they're not, why is there a need for a production at all, right? And so I think that's kind of a reductio ad absurdum that the Austrians can layer here and say, well, if that were really the case, why couldn't you just print way more money? And so it comes back to, well, no, it's because that doesn't actually work, because really it's about understanding the importance of production. And in order to have production, you need this capital structure. In order to have that capital structure, we need savings. And it's about how you coordinate that economy and how the savings all flows through into this capital structure that of interlocking stages that allow us to be more productive than we otherwise would have been. So that's something to consider there. It's also in this essay, Guido Hülsmann also talks a little bit about, the structure of ownership, right? Because inflation and deflation have winners and losers, right? So who in the chat knows who is a winner from inflation? So, Qualt's got it. Asset holders. Yeah, that they are. If you hold assets, then you are more likely to win in the inflationary scenario, right? Yeah, exactly. Cryptophiles got it. Those have equity and properties. You're winning in the inflationary scenario, right? Whereas, who are the losers in that scenario? Spot on, cash holders, right? And what does that also do? Savings. It punishes savers. Whereas if you have debt, exactly, people earning their money via paychecks, they're the losers there. All right, so here, governments issuing debt pay back at lower effective amount. They win. Debt holders. Yes, exactly. So, well, debt, yeah. So like if you, yeah, basically that's right. Yeah, that's correct. So that's essentially the system that is getting set up here. And so that is what we have to explain to our friends. Now, obviously, you can't be overbearing with your friends. You have to sort of put it in a easy way. But essentially, there is a massive injustice going on here, and people are not willing or able to understand it. And so it takes a little bit of work. And that's why some of these articles are good to share with them, because it takes time and a bit of learning, right? And look, it's not for everyone, right? Not everyone's going to go and study all of these economics books and articles and so on. But if you take the time, I think you can improve your own understanding of how some of these things are, and you can help teach some of your family and your friends a little bit. They don't necessarily need to go and learn all the detail of it, right? So, and look, for some people, that's just not interesting to them. They just want to use Bitcoin just as it is. And that's cool. That's totally fine. It's not for everyone. I think, though, that learning these things helps inoculate you in some ways. It helps inoculate you from the people who try to manipulate you, right? So governments, politicians, bureaucrats, these people, they are basically trying to manipulate society in their own direction, in their own favor. And so sometimes you've got to consider that these things are kind of like a defense against that. This is a way that you can kind of pierce through that and understand, are they telling you lies? Are they misinforming you to try and benefit themselves, right? And if they're trying to say, oh, debt doesn't matter, see, we all owe it to ourselves, that's no big deal, so the government can just go and take more debt. But what's the actual outcome here? The end result of that is that the government takes more resources of society, and that's scarce, right? So they're basically taking more of the resources for themselves to get directed by the government. And what's the problem with that? Well, the government is not subject to a profit and loss test like you and I are. So that's why they are able to essentially, that's why they end up wasting a lot of resources, because it's just not a good institutional setup for them to be productive, to be effective. So so going back to let me have a look. So redistribution. So here you can see, let me put the screen share back on. So here you can see the main impact of inflation is to bring about a redistribution of resources. There are therefore short-run benefits for certain members of society, but these benefits balanced by short-run losses for other citizens. Right? And now one of the important points, Friedrich Bastiat, who is he's seen kind of like a proto-Austrian in some ways. And so he made the point that government intervention into the market is only one set of consequences, but there's another, right? So again, it's the seen and the unseen. So that's a point there being made, that basically, for example, if the government taxes to give subsidies to a steel producer, well, obviously the benefits look good to them, but other people have lost out, right? Because it means taxpayers have less money to patronize other businesses. And who's going to speak up there for that unseen cost, that unseen benefit, right? Well, in this case, unseen cost, but you can see the benefit that would have gone to those other companies from that, from that spending. And I think a key point to understand here is also that in the case of a voluntary exchange, you have mutual assurance that both parties think they're getting a better deal they're better off out of this. So we should, use that. So we've got to understand that what deflation does and what are some of the things that it stops, right? So obviously the deflationary environment, well, it stops inflation and it destroys institutions that produce inflation. When we see this kind of bank credit deflation, we're letting that, we're washing away the inefficient part of the system, if you will. Obviously the government doesn't want to allow this, right? It keeps trying to reflate, but that's, that's just one thing there. And so I think we'll go back down to, so here, this section. So ultimately, false thinking on this point has given our governments undue leeway, of which they have made ample and bad use, right? So again, because people weren't able to intellectually fight that battle, the governments have just taken more and more ground, and they've intervened more and more into your lives, taking your resources, stopping you from spending that money on your own family and your own friends and your own community. It's kind of taking the resources away in a political way. And so ultimately, we need to take control over the money supply out of the hands of governments and make the money again subject to the principle of free association. So the first step to endorsing and promoting this strategy is to realize that governments do not, indeed cannot, fulfill any positive role whatever through the control of our money. So I think that's yeah, so that's why I really like Dieter Hulsmann's essay, Deflation and Liberty. It's a great one to give to people. But yeah, as we mentioned, so I guess I can just kind of talk you through. We can just show you the key articles that we spoke through today. So yeah, so I guess just kind of recapping, the idea is, what are some articles that talk about the problems of fiat but don't go too heavy into Bitcoin? And so this one is, how inflation drinks your milkshake. This one is, how is fiat money possible? This one is called, so this one was Why the State Demands Control of Money by Hopper. And then you've also got Deflation and Liberty. So those are some of the key ones there. And then, yeah, do you guys have any questions at this point? Awesome. Thanks very much, Dream Miners. Hopefully, yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it. And Eski's loving it. Okay, got a question here from Qualt. Yeah, so a little off topic, but if I go with the Ledger wallet, do you recommend I buy two so I have a backup? Yeah, I would say, yeah, like it's a good idea to do that. So now, why would you want to do that? So let's say you were concerned that maybe one of the wallets got tampered with, or it had, or you lost one, or you, for whatever reason, you needed another wallet just available right now to be able to spend into, to have as just a like another option. So yeah, generally it's a good idea to have a couple, and so most of them have, like, if you buy a Trezor or a Ledger, they have like the 3-pack, right? And so you can buy a couple that way. Now, my personal favorite is a cold card, but I would say it's not suitable for newbies. I would say it's one of those ones where it takes a little bit of learning. So I think for your first hardware wallet, maybe look at like a Ledger, maybe a Trezor. I think Ledger is arguably a bit more secure, but it's a bit of a nuanced discussion. It's kind of difficult, but yeah, basically, short answer, yes, have a backup is a good idea. Consider also having a metal seed backup, right? Like, Bill Fodderl, Crypto Steel, Cypher Safe, Cypher Wheel. So now, disclosure, Cypher Wheel is a sponsor of my podcast, but yeah, Cypher Wheel is a good one. So yeah, just make sure you consider that. So question here from Cryptophile. Could you explain the difference between deflation and credit deflation? Right. So the best one here is to think about the 4 types of deflation. So actually, you know what? While we're here, I may as well just pull it up 1 second. I'll just find the essay. Okay, so just screen sharing now. So you can see here, this is the essay to check out for you, Cryptophile. So in here, Joseph Salerno spells out 4 different types of deflation. So you can think of it like there's 2 that are kind of in the good bucket and 2 that are kind of in the quote unquote bad bucket. And so growth deflation is the good one, that most of the time when people are talking about beneficial deflation, growth deflation is the one they're talking about there. Now, when people are talking about credit deflation, that's when, because people are either paying back loans and money is getting destroyed in a sense. Hey, sorry guys, I think it dropped out for a second there. But So in this essay, this is one of my favorites, and we spoke about this a little bit in my recent interview with Dr. Salerno. So you can find that on my YouTube channel. It's not on my podcast stream yet, but I'll put that out in a couple of days. But it is already on YouTube or Periscope if you want to watch it there. But we spoke a little bit about that, so you can check out that interview. But if you want to look into this, you can see, for example, here, growth deflation. So that's the good one, right? And then if we go down, there's hey guys, sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened. I think it kind of dropped out. Okay, yeah, so we're back. Okay. I was just answering that question for Cryptophile. So the point there is that they're categorized. You can see these different types of deflation. And so growth deflation is that one there where, that's the good one. Cash building deflation means it's usually when more people want to hold money. And then, the bank credit deflation is the typical one that most people are thinking of there. So if we find that here, so you can see here, one of the causes of that is bank runs. And what else? Yeah, so we've got bank runs here. What else? And here, it's also interesting to note here the threat of people going in demanding redemption in specie, meaning, hey, I want my gold, or hey, I want my Bitcoins, was enough of a reason to stop them or at least reduce their lending operations. And so this actually caused a contraction in the money supply. And given that same demand for money, it was an increase in the value of money, right? So that's an interesting way to think about that. So, so that hopefully helps explain for Cryptophile, although, apologies, my connection dropped out for whatever reason. That's unusual. What stops us from having the DAOs in Bitcoin? Isn't it just a more advanced version of multi-sig? So a couple of things there. I think, at least with current day multi-sig, you can't go too many parties. That's why even I think Electrum, the default, the maximum is 15. You don't normally go above that unless you're super expert person. I wouldn't, don't go above 15 for that. That's one thing. I think if you look at some organizations in the space like BISC, for example, they have a DAO, right? They've got voting and they've got their own thing that has been built up into that. So that's kind of a separate thing there. So look, I think that's pretty much the main points from me. But yeah, guys, if you have any questions at this point, let me know. Okay, well, check out my show, stefanlivera.com, and check out ministryofnodes.com.au. So there's YouTube channels for both of those. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe and press like as well, and help me out. And look, I think that's basically it, guys. So yeah, make sure you follow me on Twitter as well if you're on there, and stay in touch there. Always happy. My DMs are open. So if you have questions about Bitcoin or you need a hand, using it in a more private, or perhaps if you want tips on using it in a more sovereign way, you can DM me. I can help you out with that. So hope you guys enjoyed that, and I'll see you guys soon.